Rising up and fighting back. The very latest from Ukraine, where courageous Ukrainian soldiers are battling back and defending the capital city of Kyiv, holding on to the capital even as Russian forces inch closer to Ukrainian President Zelensky's doorstep. Many advisors saying now that Putin was not expecting this tough resistance from Ukraine as international aid pours in, including Germany, saying over the weekend it will, in fact, deliver anti-tank and Stinger missiles to Ukraine and raise its defense spending. Adding to the anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles from the U.S., UK, Poland, and the Baltic states, which have helped Ukrainians fight literally in urban contact on the streets as residents spend the night in bomb shelters. The U.S. and Europe have also reached an agreement to limit access of select Russian banks to the SWIFT global payments messaging system and impose restrictions on the ability of Russia's central bank to handle reserves. President Biden authorizing $350 million worth of additional military arms on Saturday. Joining me right now to discuss the response from Congress is GOP Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy. GOP Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. Congressman, it's good to see you this morning. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, Maria.
The most pressing issue, of course, just in the last few minutes, as we understand, President Putin has put his nuclear forces on alert. Your reaction?
Well, when you look at Putin, this man is reckless, evil, and dangerous. There's two reasons why he could be doing this. One, because this war is not going well and he's being painted into a corner and he wants to be a stronger hand to try to negotiate a way out. The second one is he's unstable, that he will literally try to have a nuclear weapon option going forward. At this moment in time, no country in the world should stand with Putin. Everyone should unite around the basis of what he just claimed to take in just the last hours.
6 months ago, Joe Biden gave Putin the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We know that energy, oil and gas is what is really going to impact Putin and his cronies. What should be done now?
Well, first of all, it wasn't just Nord Stream 2, it was how he moved out of Afghanistan. Then when he meets with him, he gives him Nord Stream 2 with no other options. Remember what Nord Stream 2 is. It is a second pipeline to provide natural gas to Germany. But this pipeline goes around Ukraine, because the current pipeline, they have to pay Ukraine revenues going forward. So it was always a punishment going forward. But now that we find what Putin is trying to do through all of this is he didn't see deterrent. What President Biden should have done, he should have supplied the weapons that he talks about today to the Ukraine. I had this conversation with President Biden in advance, telling him I do not believe that Putin is afraid of sanctions. He's lived with them for years. He knows how to get around them. What he really needs is a deterrent. Think about if President Zelensky, how far that they are fighting. Think if they had half the weapons we've left in Afghanistan. They would have paid for them. But Russia would have never entered. Russia would have been falling even today. Think if Zelensky would have taken President Biden's advice of leaving the country. It would have collapsed. He is a modern-day Winston Churchill. We do not need a Neville Chamberlain to appease some other dictator like Putin. That we've watched through history how that was a mistake. This is a moment in time. Even America taking the option of supplying Ukraine with weapons is correct, but it's harder to supply them today. We should have taken those actions sooner, and we should learn from this moment in time that we should speed up the sales of weapons to Taiwan for what the future looks at and what China's looking at happening today as well.
So will you be encouraging that this upcoming week? You're right. Biden authorized the $350 million defense aid package on Friday only after we heard President Zelensky say, I don't need a ride. I need ammo. And that pushed this into action. You're just back from Israel, and I know you spent time with the leadership in Israel, as well as Bibi Netanyahu. Tell us what they were saying about this current conflict. We were worried about Iran getting a nuclear weapon. Now we're worried about not only Iran, but also Putin using his stockpile.
I would say people are very afraid of JCPOA, the negotiations, the other action that President Biden took when he took to the administration. They started a negotiation with Iran. Remember, the last plan allowed Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Now they're moving forward. It may even be weaker. This puts a fear in all of the Middle East for Iran ever to have a nuclear weapon. If you're worried about what Putin said today, think about what Iran says every single day when it wants to wipe Israel and America off the face of the earth. We would never want to have Iran or never allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon. These were many discussions that we had with the Prime Minister, with the former Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu. This is a real concern. But we're also talking about Ukraine, because what Europe needs and its actions that have taken before, America can supply the natural gas to Ukraine. The action of the Biden administration has made it harder on America to do that. Our gas price is higher. We're spending $53 million a day is going to Putin to fund his war. They are supplying more crude to America, not less. These are the actions we should take and speed up our ability to drill and supply and shut Putin down economically as well.
Well, this clearly will be overhanging the upcoming State of the Union address. Congressman, I know that you will be there in the chamber at the State of the Union address. What are you expecting to hear from Joe Biden on Tuesday night? And do you believe that there should be any change of course in the face of this war in Eastern Europe?
Yes, and we're going to offer, the President Biden has asked for a supplemental of billions of dollars for Ukraine. We're asking that if we put in there to speed up the process, give us the XL pipeline. Let's have a movement to speed up our ability to drill on federal lands. Let's put a speed up ability to send LNG to Europe as well. Those are the things we'd look for adding, because that would be more detrimental even than in the sanctions going forward long term. Well, the president, what is he going to talk about in the State of the Union? I'd love him to say that he's going to change course and secure the border, stop the fentanyl and illegal individuals from crossing this border. And we're finding also that we have people on the terrorist watch list. What about the economy and inflation itself? Instead of this Build Back Better, raising more inflation, change course on that. What about the security, as you see every day in New York and every city across America, crime continuing to rise based upon these Democratic policies of defunding the police and on upholding the law? What are we doing about energy independence? These are all things that he can change the course on, make America stronger from that predicament, but also make the world safer.
You have the Governor Kim Reynolds delivering the GOP response after Tuesday night. The Democrats have put forth Representative Rashida Tlaib to speak on behalf of Democrats. What are we going to hear from these responses? And what does that tell us right there on who the Democrats chose to respond to President Biden?
Well, think of the greater of the contrast. I mean, the Democrats chose an individual who doesn't really even consider herself a Democrat. She considers herself a socialist Democrat. She rallies the cry to defund the police. She makes the movement of opening up the border. She believes in this inflation of moving forward, of spending more money in government instead of controlling where we are. A miss after miss. And then you've got Governor Kim Reynolds, who, what did she do with her own state? She just lowered taxes. She just provided more freedom and more security. It is a great contrast in the direction of that America needs to go. But more importantly, a simple question that can ask, too, for every single American. Do parents have a right in their kids' education? I know Kim Reynolds will say yes. Yeah. I don't know that Tlaib will say yes.
Congressman, the Capitol fencing is being reinstalled going into the State of the Union address. 700 National Guardsmen being deployed as the trucker convoy makes its way to Washington. Your reaction to all of this, what is Tuesday night going to look like along the Capitol?
You know what? Those National Guard and that fencing should be in America, but it should be along our borders, not around the People's House. The People's House should be open to the people. Unfortunately, Democrats don't believe that. Why can't they secure our borders with that? I think America and the Capitol is a safe place to be. The People's House should be able to enjoy it, be able to hear what's going on. Why is the fear of Americans, and why don't we have a secure border? Another contrast in the direction of where we're going with this current administration and the leadership of Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden. I think it's a missed opportunity to make America stronger and why we're in the situation we are today.
And Congressman, before you go, do you believe that the U.S. will get back into the Iran deal within weeks? Because that's the word on the street. It's extraordinary to me that the U.S. and the Iranian negotiating teams, the mediator is actually Russia. Can you explain this?
It is wrong that we're even back into the new negotiations. The real action should be we should impose greater sanctions on Iran so they would never have a nuclear weapon and they would play in the world and stop funding terrorists around the world. This is a wrong approach, once again, that the Biden administration is taking. I raised this with the president just this week on a phone call. But the one concern that I have, especially coming back from Israel and the Middle East, this is a fear that all the countries in the Middle East. Why aren't we building on the Abraham Accords, making the Middle East safer, instead of moving back in with Iran? Them having a nuclear weapon makes the world so unsafe. And if you think Putin is reckless and evil, think about a nuclear weapon in the hands of Iran. Not only do they fund terrorism, they propose it, and they train around the world to make us less safe. This is a wrong approach, and we will rule the day if they come back with a new JCPOA.
Congressman, thanks very much for weighing in. We'll be watching your leadership in the coming weeks. Certainly, Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy joining us this morning in Washington.